So my very first manual flight with the Avata 2 was 2 weeks ago, actually 2 weeks and 2 days, and in those 2 weeks of flying almost every single day, I've learned a lot, crashed multiple times, and gone from being pretty nervous to fly in manual mode to being able to put the drone exactly where I want it pretty confidently. Now I'm obviously nowhere near an FPV pro yet, but I thought I'd share what I've learned in hopes that it might be helpful for others who want to start flying in manual mode with their Avata or another FPV drone. Now I'm definitely not new to drones. I've been flying GPS camera drones for 5 or 6 years, and I'm pretty good at it if I dare say so myself. But flying FPV drones was something kind of intimidating to me. I saw all these amazing FPV shots on YouTube and Instagram, but it seemed like I'd have to dedicate so much time to learning all about FPV drones, how to build and repair them, and how to control a drone in a completely different way that I could just never justify getting into FPV. When DJI released the original DJI FPV and the original Avata, they definitely lowered that barrier to entry, but both of those drones had some pretty significant flaws, which again kept me on the sidelines of FPV. So when I saw that DJI was releasing the Avata 2, I decided this was the time to make the jump into FPV. So I put in my order on launch day, and even before I got the drone, I started practicing in the simulator. Now unfortunately DJI discontinued support for their own FPV simulator earlier this year. No idea why they thought that was a good idea, but they did, and so you'll have to use some other simulator. The two I've personally used are FPV Skydive and Curry Kitten, of which I much prefer Curry Kitten because it gives you a lot more customization, so you can make the simulated drone behave a lot more like the Avata 2. I've also heard really good things about the liftoff simulator, but it's about 14 gigabytes to download, and my internet wasn't quite up for the challenge of downloading it, so I stuck to some of the more lightweight sims. And putting in a few hours in the simulator before you try to fly in manual mode is really important, especially if you're coming from GPS drones, because the controls on a manual FPV drone are pretty different from a regular camera drone. You have to manually control the throttle, you don't have any altitude hold, and you're manually controlling pitch, roll, and yaw instead of just telling the drone which way to go. I didn't actually spend that much time in the simulator before my first flight, probably somewhere around 4 hours, but you at least need to get to where you can keep the drone stable in the air and not have it just tumbling to the ground, and have a basic understanding of what the controls do. But flying in the simulator will only get you so far, so it was time to actually do this for real. So after I got the drone and unboxed it, the first day I pretty much stuck to normal and sport modes to get the feel of flying with the goggles. I did flip into manual mode just really briefly and did a couple of shaky circles high up in the sky, but mostly it was just sticking to normal and sport mode. That evening I went back and did a little bit more practice in the sim to make sure I was up to speed on my skills, and then the next morning I decided it was time to go for it. So I strapped into the goggles, took off, switched into manual mode, and immediately I was hooked. This is fun. That was scary. Let's do a roll. Almost hit that tree. Whoa! Dive right down the mountain. Woo! We did it! I love this. I was actually pretty surprised with how easy it was to fly in manual mode. The drone just felt a lot more stable and controlled than in the simulator I was using. I was already having a great time diving pretty low over the treetops at 60 miles an hour, even did a couple flips and rolls, and most importantly, I didn't crash. Now, to fly the Avata 2 in manual mode, you'll need to adjust the tension of the throttle stick on the remote so that it doesn't automatically recenter itself when you let go of it. And that's because for FPV, we're directly controlling the throttle, not just telling the drone to go up and down, so we need to be able to have the throttle stay put wherever we leave it, all the way from 0 at the bottom to 100% at the top, and not always have it auto resetting. And so to do that, you've just got to pop off the rubber cover on the back of the controller and tighten the F2 screw to get rid of the spring tension that recenters it, and also tighten the F1 screw to add a little bit of damping so the stick isn't just flopping around. And you'll also need to change the custom mode on the mode switch from sport mode to manual mode in the settings. And then to get into manual mode, you can either take off in normal mode and then flip the switch into manual mode, and it will show in the goggles where to put the throttle to switch into manual. That's how I usually do it. Or you can just arm the props in manual mode before you take off by double tapping the start stop button on the remote, but I definitely recommend taking off in normal mode when you're starting out. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. Back to the video. So after those first couple flights, I was really eager to fly more, but I was going to be gone that afternoon, so I decided to take the Avata with me, and I managed to find a couple of great locations to fly at with some beautiful green hills, hay bales, cows, all that good stuff. I flew all 3 of my batteries and started getting a little bit more comfortable zipping up and down the hills, diving in, making turns, all of those different moves. And especially in these first few flights, the brake button on the remote was a real lifesaver. Whenever I started to get disoriented or confused by the controls or felt like I was flipping the drone over and couldn't figure out how to get it back upright, I could just hit the brake button and the drone would nearly instantly come to a stop, right itself, and then I could just fly in normal mode or flip it back into manual. And on those next 3 flights, I started getting some really great shots. I dove downhill with a bunch of cows, flew along a line of hay bales, and a bunch more. But I made one mistake that ruined all of my shots from those flights. So I had seen that if you switched rock-steady image stabilization off, the Avata 2 will record gyro data into the files, which you can then use to stabilize that footage in gyroflow and get smoother results than using the built-in rock-steady stabilization. So partway through one of my flights, I decided these are such good shots that I'm getting that I want to be able to post-stabilize them and get the absolutely best results out of them. So I went into the settings and switched off rock-steady and went happily on my way diving the hills. The only problem is that I had the field of view set to ultra wide, and the Avata 2 only records gyro data if the field of view is set to wide, not ultra wide. So when I got to my computer and brought all of the footage from that afternoon into gyroflow, I couldn't stabilize any of it because there wasn't any gyroflow and it was all essentially unusable, which was a big letdown. So if you want to stabilize in gyroflow, make sure your field of view is set to wide, not ultra wide or normal, because otherwise all of the footage will be basically unusably shaky and there's no way to stabilize it in post. Now I did learn from that and figure out how to shoot the footage properly to work with gyroflow, and it does produce much better results than the built-in rocksteady, but it was a painful lesson to learn that. By the way, if you want to avoid a lot of mistakes like this and get the best shots with your Avata 2, I've made a PDF checklist of all the best settings for getting cinematic videos with the Avata 2, so you can easily reference that while you're out flying. So make sure to check that out. I'll put a link in the description where you can download it completely for free. Back to the video. So after that, the next several flights went pretty smoothly. I was just getting better at controlling the drone, building my confidence, and I was mostly flying still well above any obstacles, trying not to fly between things or get super close to stuff because my skills just weren't up to that point. And up to this point, although I'd clipped the top of a tree or two just a little bit, I had avoided any major crashes. But that didn't last for long. So towards the end of one of my flights, I was feeling extra confident and decided it was time to try flying low level under a pear tree, a fairly small gap. Now ever since my first manual flight, I had kind of had a hard time controlling the drone at slower speeds closer to the ground, but I had flown under this particular tree probably half a dozen plus times in sport mode, so I thought it couldn't be that hard to get through it in manual mode. So I tried to hit the gap. As I was coming up, I was bouncing back and forth all over the place. I should have just aborted the attempt, but I didn't, and things went wrong. Just as I was going through, and I actually would have been in the clear if I had just kept going, I got scared that I was going to hit the limb above me and dropped the throttle and went slamming right into the ground. So I regretfully walked over there, found it, and it had landed right in the mud. Probably the one single place on our whole farm where there was mud that I could have crashed into, but there it was in the mud, all covered in mud. So I picked it up, pulled the battery out, got it all cleaned up, and turned out the drone was fine. It was a big headache to get all the mud off, but it didn't break anything. The only problem was that the gimbal wasn't quite smooth on the next couple of flights, and it would give gimbal errors because a little bit of the grit from the mud had gotten into the motors of the gimbal, but after working it back and forth a little bit, that problem went away and hasn't come back. So needless to say, that crash knocked my confidence down quite a bit. But I was determined to learn FPV, so I went back, practiced some more in the simulator, and I realized that one of the biggest things I needed to work on was managing my throttle. When you're flying along close to the ground, it's easy to bounce up and down a lot, and you don't want that. Instead, you want to be super smooth and precise with the throttle so you can just glide along at a few feet above the ground. And I feel this is something that is really important in learning to fly manual, just figuring out what areas you need to improve in and then intentionally practicing those skills both in the simulator and then in real life. So over the next few days, I was shooting for a documentary that unfortunately didn't include any drone shots, but on the way back from the shoots, I would find some spots where I could practice flying and diving some bigger ridge lines, just putting in more practice to solidify my skills. And then a couple days later, back on the farm, I decided to try flying low level again, and would you know it, I crashed again. I was trying to turn through a bit of a gap through some branches, and I didn't really turn sharp enough, somehow ended up getting the drone going sideways and smashing right into a bush, flipped the drone over several times, and ended up upside down on the ground. I didn't really feel like trekking up to get it, so I just used turtle mode to flip it back over. And the sensors were kind of going crazy from the crash, so I decided to just manually start up the motors and take off in manual mode, which was a bad idea. I started trying to fly forward, but there were some things that I was going to run into, got going too fast, so I tried to stop, but instead I drifted right back into another bush that the drone got caught in. So I had to go up there, get the drone anyway. Thankfully, it was again just fine, other than being covered in a bunch of shredded leaves. And the Avata 2 is quite a tough drone. Just the way it's designed, it can withstand a fair bit of impact, which is really good because you are going to end up crashing it if you're going to learn manual FPV. So from the second crash, another thing that I realized I needed to practice more was my turns. With an FPV drone, you can't just turn the yaw stick to the right or left like you can with a typical DJI camera drone. You have to coordinatedly use both the roll and yaw to make the turn, and how much roll versus yaw you need depends on how much the drone is pitched forward, how fast you're flying. Plus, you need to be able to control if you want to drift to the outside of a turn or stay tight in the middle. And figuring all that out and getting it programmed into your brain just requires a bit of practice and repetition. Somewhere around this point, I downloaded the Curry Kitten simulator instead of the one that I had been using. Don't ask me why it's called Curry Kitten, but it works quite well. And I was able to dial in my settings to make it feel pretty similar to the Avata 2, and I'll put those settings up on the screen if you want to try it out. And in that simulator, there's a forest valley map with a circle road where you have to fly between rock walls and trees. So I flew around that road a whole bunch of times, just getting the feel of how to mix the yaw and roll controls together to get the drone exactly where I wanted it to be. And from there, I just kept practicing going for progressively tighter and closer spaces in between trees and practicing my coordinated turns and my throttle management. And one thing that I learned is that most of the time you don't want to be pitching the drone up and down to gain or lose altitude so much. That is good if you intentionally want to dive down something, but when you just want to adjust your altitude as you're flying over something to not hit something or to get closer to something, and generally you just want to increase or lower your throttle to punch it up and down and keep that horizon the same. That both makes a smoother shot and gives you a lot finer control of your altitude. And as you put in more time with the drone, the controls just sort of start to get programmed into your brain what to do to put the drone in a certain place, so you don't even have to think about it as much, and it really starts to become more fun, and you just start to feel like you're just naturally flowing through the air. And as I gained confidence, something I started to do to practice my skills was, instead of just flying over the tops of the trees, to start flying down between the tips of the trees and hit little gaps and all that kind of stuff to just push the edge of the limits of my skills a little bit and get better at controlling the drone. Now, as I've gotten the basics down, something that I found to be really helpful is to find a cool looking line that you want to get good at flying and keep flying that multiple times, perfecting it until you have it really dialed in. This just gets you a lot of reps on actually smoothing out some of those maneuvers and going exactly where you want to go, instead of just sort of letting the drone go wherever it happens to like to go. And when you're doing this, and just in general with FPV, don't be afraid to abort a line or a shot if it doesn't feel like it's going right. It's much better to pull up and away from a gap or an obstacle and come back around and hit it again than to crash into it. Another thing that you start getting used to after a while of flying FPV is judging your surroundings in the goggles. From flying GPS drones with narrower cameras, I was used to always kind of being afraid of what was over on the side or the top or the bottom, but with the super wide FPV camera, you have a lot better spatial awareness, so if you're kind of doing a little orbit around something, you can sort of see out of the corner of your eye where you're going and make sure you don't hit into it. And after 2 weeks of practice, while I still have a long ways to go, I've started to be able to get cinematic FPV shots similar to what inspired me to start learning FPV in the first place. And all in all, I can 100% recommend the Avata 2 if you want to learn FPV, and that's my completely unsponsored opinion. I bought the drone with my own money, so it's totally unbiased. It's just really fun, creates great results. I haven't really had any issues with the flight characteristics or handling. It's a pretty tough drone, 3 pretty solid crashes so far and no damage. It has a great camera, pretty close to GoPro quality, has all the fail-safes and GPS features that make it so much easier to learn. All in all, it's a great product. And if you'd like to learn how to make your Avata 2 shots look amazing and download the free LUT that I used to color grade a lot of the footage in this video, you can click right here for another video. Make sure to like this video and subscribe for more videos like this.